Hi and welcome back. While this is primarily a watercolour art channel, I've been tempted recently to have a go at using acrylics. So this is my first proper go at painting an acrylic landscape. So I'm going to use ordinary watercolour paper. The watercolour paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford cold pressed. £140 weight, this one. It's a little bit heavier than my usual £90, but I bought a batch of £140 to try. I'm using old cheap brushes. They're not Harky brushes, they're more like just ordinary flat wash brushes, goat hair, because you don't want to use your best brushes for acrylic paints because it can ruin them if you let them dry out. Now I've wet the page all over and I'm now using yellow ochre, just a cheap old yellow ochre acrylic paint, and I'm going to mix up a mixture of, I think it's cerulean blue and black, again just cheap old acrylics that you can buy from any old shop, and I'm just going to put it across the top the same way I do with watercolour. Beginning to run down and diffuse a little bit, so I'm going to darken it up across the top and put in some corresponding darks across the bottom just to sort of balance things up and to start off a very loose foreground. I want this to be a very loose painting, same as my watercolour paintings are loose. And now I'm just tilting it up to allow any very wet paint to run across the painting horizontally to increase the effect of the look of a landscape. Just going to softly and gently, while the paper is still wet, pull some paint down. Now this acrylic is not really diffusing in the same way as watercolour. It's doing fairly well, but I'm going to have to be careful. I'm not sure whether or not I'll end up with some hard marks in the sky, but it's an experiment, so we'll see what happens when it dries. I've turned it round the right way. It is still damp, and in a similar way to the way I paint watercolour, I'm going to, with a smaller brush, pull up some tree shapes, and you can see them. The wet in wet, you can see them sort of softening and diffusing and bursting out a little bit into the wet, and I think that looks quite interesting. Just going to sort of clean off the bottom edge a little bit, just soften it back, and then just soften this tree line a bit, maybe add some darks and lights, and just adjust it until I think it looks like the loose impression of a distant tree line. Now I'll have a few more trees over on this other side, I think. But first I'll establish a few more darks across the bottom. I want the bottom left corner to be really dark and to have some nice sort of lines leading in a kind of diagonal across the foreground, so that the eye is led towards those distant trees and the sort of snowy white lighter area in the middle. Now these distant trees are going to be a bit further back, so I'm painting them in a much paler sort of grey and keeping them a bit smaller, softening them back as well, trying to keep them looking as if they are further in the distance and just disappearing into the mist a bit. Just add some slightly darker paint, just sweep it off towards the right, just to look like a sort of bank of land, or maybe part of a sort of a hedge coming across the landscape there. Just adding a little bit of tone, a little bit of texture. Just balancing the composition up a little bit more, sort of just a little bit of something and nothing really, just to look like shrubs and grasses. Now let's see if the card works on the acrylic, and yep, it's pulling through the paint quite nicely and giving me the suggestion of etched trees and branches. Just going to keep working on that side until it looks as if there's a nice tree line there. Trying to keep the branches looking sort of fairly random, and then just a few finer lines pulled out through these far distant trees, again just to hint at branches and trunks. And while I've got the card, I'll etch out some grasses across the bottom edge, just to pull the foreground together a little bit. Got nice dark rich paint there, and with this acrylic paint the card seems to be working really well to pull through and create these kind of marks. So I'm going to take advantage of that effect to more or less finish off my foreground, I think. I think I'll just pull some card marks just across there under that sort of hedge line there to maybe establish the sort of look of the field, and to increase that kind of look of maybe a sort of snowy landscape with some paler marks there showing through. There's a couple of paint splashes there. I'll see if I can soften them off, but no, I think the acrylic paint is dried there, so we'll just have them as birds landing on the snow, I think. A happy accident. Alright, maybe try putting a bush in here with some thick paint and a bit of texture on the hedge. Actually, no, I don't like that. It looks too lumpy there. It doesn't look right. I'm just going to wipe that off as much as possible. Starting to dry already. Acrylic dries quite quickly. And pull the card mark back through there. Just soften it back a little bit if I can. That's fine. It just gives me that kind of loose foreground again without that bush in the way. It's more or less dry now, just damp, so I'm just going to add a bit more brushwork to these trees and just to try and shape them a little bit better. And I think that's it. I think it's time to leave it to completely dry now. Right, well, it's completely dry now, and I think you can see that it's while the paint hasn't behaved quite in the same way as watercolour would, we've still got quite a nice soft and loose look to the sky and the foreground. I like the way that some of the paint has diffused, giving us like soft and hard edges. I think just going to, yeah, it's nice and dry. I'm going to just put a few birds in using a rigger brush. It's a bit dark. Don't want the birds to be too big because the trees are quite a small scale here, so I just want fairly small birds really. Just a small patch. Slightly larger one in the foreground. I think that will do for the birds now. Just define that one, this sort of closest one, a little bit more, and then just dab off a bit of the darker paint. And lastly, I think all I want to do is run a bit of a shadow under this main tree here, just to draw attention to it a little bit more and to bed it down into the snow. I think that will do. So that's finished now. I think it's time to have a look at it without the tape on, so I can see it with a clean white border hopefully, and see if it needs any adjustments. But I think it looks quite nice actually, considering it's acrylic and not watercolour. I think I should be doing more of these, but don't worry, I will be the main content of the channel will be watercolour, but every now and again I'll throw in an acrylic as well as I continue to experiment. When I do more acrylics, I'll make a separate playlist for them. Be easier to find them and keep them separate from the watercolours that way. Now I like this. I think it looks really nice with a limited palette of 2 colours. I think it's worked out quite well. I think if we zoom in and look a little bit more closely at some of the marks that have been made. Right, here across the bottom edge, I really like this dry brushwork here, and the paler dry brush across the middle, and that unpainted area in the middle looks like a snowy plain. And while the sky isn't perfectly diffused, as can sometimes happen with transparent watercolour, I quite like this brooding sort of sky that's laden with more snow. So my conclusion is that I'm quite pleased with how the acrylics performed, and I shall certainly be experimenting a bit more. Well, thanks so much for watching and for your support, and thank you to my patrons for supporting this channel. I couldn't do it without you, so thanks so much. And please click on the like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and click on the bell icon, and you'll get a notification every time I upload a new video. Okay, take care, stay safe and happy painting. See you soon. Bye.